All right, now let's talk about Africa real quick. A couple important stories. The first from Al Jazeera. A new report from the investigative website Disclose has revealed that France is aware that the intelligence it provides the Egyptian military is being used to kill civilians. So there are civilian smugglers who are bringing things from Libya into Egypt, and France is providing intelligence to the Egyptians about that smuggling. And they now know that the France military was implicated in at least 19 airstrikes against civilians between 2016 and 2019. This was initially begun under the previous French president, not Macron, but Francis Hollande, and it continued despite the concern of the both French intelligence and part of the military as well. And so, yeah, I mean, they really just don't care about people in Africa as much grandstanding as the West does about, oh, we need to help the refugees and help people who are suffering and everything like that. Really what it's about is appeasing the governments that they're friendly with, like the Egyptian government, and they really don't care who gets killed in the process. Another example of this is the EU's Coast Guard agency, which is Frontex, based in Warsaw, has been aiding the Libyan Coast Guard in intercepting and detaining migrants attempting to make it into Europe. This isn't just people who are within like Libyan territorial waters or something like that. This is essentially anybody they could prevent from getting to Europe by stopping them at any point in the Mediterranean Sea and bringing them back to Libya. And this is by backing the Libyan Coast Guard that is one of the most brutal military, quote unquote agencies there are. They've been reported to carry out murders, rapes. They fire on life rafts and stuff like that to sink them. Just an absolutely atrocious agency. And again, it's being aided by the EU. They recently gave the Libyan Coast Guard 4 patrol boats to help them, catch people. And while they deny claims that Frontex denies claims that it's helping the Libyan Coast Guard, it's pretty clear to see that regularly Frontex will spot migrants, and then the next thing you know, the Libyan authorities show up and arrest them all. Now, as bad as it is, the Libyan Coast Guard operating in the sea, they're even worse on land, where they have horrific conditions in their detention centers. The biggest one, overcrowding. There's reports from detention centers that people sleep in shifts. There's not enough room for everybody to sleep, so they have to rotate so everybody is able to sleep. They've talked about rapes and murders in these prisons, that the Libyan Coast Guard is involved in human trafficking. The UN believes that they've carried out murders and things like that. And again, this is being helped all along by the EU. And of course, this is at the same time the EU is all upset about how Belarus is handling migrants on the border with Poland. It's just so much hypocrisy. One other story about Libya, and that is Saif al-Islam, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, was ruled by a Libyan court that he can run for president of Libya. This came after one of his representatives tried to submit appeal and was blocked by militants. And apparently there are enough people who support Saif al-Islam to go out, carry out protests, and that's what got him back on the ballot for the election. So, interesting that he's going to be able to run, and that election is coming up in about 3 weeks now on December 24th. 14 people killed in Burkina Faso, 11 civilians and 3 soldiers. This is just a part of the violence that's occurring in this part of the world, largely, I think, as a result of the U.S. war in Libya and the instability it caused, and the French forever war in Mali that's been going on since 2013 as well. There's an announcement of a new 4-state coalition to carry out military operations against the militants in this area. It's Burkina Faso, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Togo, which I mentioned earlier in the show, was getting new counterterrorism funds from Saudi Arabia. And so that, there's already thousands of forces supplied to the area, and they've already created different coalitions in this area with Burkina Faso, Mali, Eritrea, and Nigeria. I think it was 6 countries, so Chad as well. And they were supposed to, stop these armed groups, and it didn't really work there. My guess is that a lot of times these governments take the money and the weapons that they get from other aid countries like Saudi Arabia, and then they use it for their own political reasons in their country, as well as maybe killing some terrorists, and it only exacerbates the violence overall. So there's this interesting thing that happened. There's a French military convoy redeploying from the Ivory Coast to Mali. And in between the Ivory Coast and Mali, if you're driving, you go through Niger. And once this military convoy, which was fairly large, entered Niger, it ran into what is reported to be a crowd of hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters standing in the middle of the road. Not exactly sure how exactly things escalated, but the French say, I think, that they, fired warning shots, and something people are now dead. There's people injured. I think a local authority said it was most likely inflicted by gunshots. Again, even if the French are shooting, it doesn't necessarily mean that this person was shot by a French soldier. However, it is pretty clear that the French military activity in the region did end up with these 2 people being killed. One more on Niger. This is important. Turkey will sell light aircraft and unmanned aerial drones, which I'm pretty sure can be armed. I don't know if, maybe the ones they're selling them can't be, but I'm fairly certain that the drones they're selling can be armed. And those are going to be sent to Niger. And so I would guess that country is ramping up a terror war and is going to start carrying out attacks against, whoever it labels as terrorist. In Ethiopia, the government, which now has the president Abiy Ahmed at the front of the lines, reported taking territory from the Tigrayan forces. I believe this was in the Hamara region. Not sure if this is a sign that the tide of the war is turning back in favor of the Ethiopian government, or if this was just some small victory, or if the victory didn't even happen. This is just Ethiopian government propaganda. But the fighting is going on, and the Ethiopians are reporting now that they are making progress. This is the site, by the way, that they retook. I'm sure a lot of people have seen these, I believe they're Christian temples that are literally carved into the ground. It's the craziest thing. They're like 3 stories tall, and they're carved straight down into the stone. And I guess, anytime there's fighting in regions like this, I want to take a second to point out the historical region for it. Just like in Sanaa, there's World Heritage Site is one of the oldest cities on the planet. Thousands of year old, like really cool, like mud houses that they have, these structures that they have in the old city of Sanaa that are being destroyed. Although at the same time, I don't want to take away from the fact that, like, if, one of those houses died, like a bunch of kids probably died in there too, which is far worse than the destruction of these structures, no matter how cool they are and like how unique they are. But when fighting happens around these World Heritage sites, people take more of a notice and care a little bit more. Part of the reason that the Ethiopian government may be making progress is they have been getting more support from the UAE. A report from Al Jazeera, they took a bunch of satellite imagery and stuff like that and determined that the UAE was shipping a bunch of military aid, but particularly even some drones to the Ethiopian government, which gives the Ethiopian government a huge advantage over the Tigrayan forces, who don't have any air force whatsoever. And so that could, if the tide of the war is turning, it could possibly be because the UAE has given Ethiopia a bunch of new military equipment. Ethiopia is accusing the U.S. of spreading shameful misinformation. I'm not sure exactly why the Ethiopian government is saying this, if it's true or not, but it does, I think, signal to me that the Ethiopian government at least doesn't feel like it's being backed by the U.S. government, and I think that generally aligns with my thoughts on the issue, which is that the U.S. is tending to at least, I don't know how much support the U.S. has actually given the Tigrayan forces, but I think that is the side of the war that the U.S. prefers. One last story on Ethiopia, and that is Sudan says several of its troops were killed by Ethiopian forces along the border. I'm not sure what's exactly going on here. I know Sudan actually borders in part the Tigray region of Ethiopia. I'm not sure what side Sudan prefers, the Tigrayan government or the Tigrayans or the Ethiopians or anything like that. But it does seem that there was some skirmish there. It could turn into a larger thing. It could just be a one-off. A top Sudanese general warns the country could be a source of refugee influx into Europe if instability continues. This obviously seems to be the case, especially when you have 35 people being killed in other ethnic violence in Sudan. Aside from what's going on, people protesting the government, the clash on the border with Ethiopia, just thinking about where these people will go and how they would likely try to get to Europe, which would be through Libya, and what we talked about, how much Frontex and the EU is backing the Libyan Coast Guard. If any Sudanese tried to get to Europe through Libya, they could be facing a very rough time. All right, last thing I talk about is the Ugandan forces are now working with the Congolese government and have invaded the Congo to take on the Allied Democratic Forces. I really don't know a whole lot about this conflict. I know the Congo has been concerned with and trying to fight a campaign against the ADF for years now, to little, if no success. It seems largely... You know what? I can't even say that. It seems from Western reporting that I have seen, like particularly from Reuters and stuff like that, that the campaign against the ADF has led maybe to more ADF attacks or just more militia attacks by some groups against civilians in the Congo in the past couple of years. But that could be more of a reporting thing. It just happened to get into the English press than actually there being a sharp increase in attacks by the ADF forces against civilians or something like that. But this is a pretty big issue. There are 1,700 Ugandan forces that have crossed into the Congo. They've carried out airstrikes against ADF facilities and other things like that. And, this isn't the first time Ugandan forces have been used elsewhere in Africa. They were heavily used by the African Union Force in Somalia, and a Somali court has recently sentenced 5 Ugandan soldiers and convicted them of crimes, sentencing 2 to death. They were for the killings of civilians unlawfully during a gun battle between Ugandan forces and Al-Shabaab. Don't have a lot of details on actually what happened here, but Ugandan forces are carrying out war crimes in Somalia. I would tend to guess that they'll do the same thing in the Congo, especially if they're trying to fight somewhat similar insurgency with the ADF. Not saying that they're in any way tied or to Al-Shabaab or anything, but they seem to be fairly well fortified and have existed in the Congo for several years, kind of like Al-Shabaab is in Somalia. In Somalia, we had an explosion outside of a school, killing 8. I believe Al-Shabaab did carry out this attack, and it was directed at UN staff members who escaped unharmed. The last thing, one last story on Uganda, and that is just come out that the Ugandan government was, or I guess it isn't clear if it was the Ugandan government, but 2 Ugandan journalists and a Ugandan politician were notified by Apple that they were the targets of state-sponsored attacks on their phone, including at least one with the NSO group's Pegasus software. It's, again, I guess unclear of exactly who was trying to carry out the surveillance on the phone. Really suggests it was the Ugandan government by, who was targeted, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And it's just more of a fallout of from the NSO group's Pegasus software spying on all these phones across the world. All right, everybody, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. I'm trying to do a little bit more coverage on Africa recently. I think it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And, I'm very glad that I interviewed Danny Sherjan over the summer about Ethiopia and had the background that I do on that conflict, or else it would be even harder to talk about than it is. But if anybody wants more information, I do want to recommend Skyhorn interviewed the War Nerd. I talked about his article, but if you're one of these people that I was at a point, I drove around all day long and just had time to listen to stuff. I really recommend checking out that interview. Not only is there so much important information in there on Ethiopia, but you learn about how the wars are fought, and that really does at least help me to understand, what's going on in Yemen and Afghanistan and other countries, how these militant groups are fighting successful campaigns against much more powerful governments.